This is a weird story that happened back when I was a teenager. My grandparents had a really small farm located in a small hollow. It wasn't a commercial farm, just something they had to support themselves. However, when they got older, it was more difficult for them to maintain the farm. They quit using the barn. It just sort of sat there and was used as a storage area mainly. Every Thanksgiving and Christmas, we would go to our grandparents' house. This story took place on Thanksgiving. I was 15 years old, and that's the age where I began not enjoying hanging out with the adults in my family anymore. Suddenly, listening to the stories of when I was a kid or when my parents were kids was just not that entertaining anymore. We had Thanksgiving dinner early. It was about 2 p.m. Afterwards, I was beginning to feel a bit antsy. I let my parents know that I was going to go explore the hollow a little bit. It had been a while since I had done so. I didn't even think of asking my younger brother and sister if they wanted to go. It was fine because honestly, I felt like being by myself. I knew that I didn't really have a lot of time to explore before it got dark, so I set out and made sure I knew how far I could go and still get back before the sun had set. I didn't do the greatest job at it though. If you've ever been out exploring the woods, you might probably know what I mean. You can get easily fascinated with the woods in the hills and lose track of time. It got very, very dark before I was anywhere close to being home. By the time I got back to the farm, it had been dark for at least an hour. I had never really been out by the barn when it was dark outside. It looked incredibly creepy. Being a teenage boy, I, of course, liked scary things. The thought then occurred to me that if the barn was creepy looking on the outside, it must be really creepy on the inside. I decided to check it out. Getting into the barn was simple. My grandparents rarely locked the door of their house, much less thought about locking the barn. They lived in a really safe area where crime was pretty much unheard of. The barn did not have one of those heavy wooden locks on it. I honestly have no idea what they are called, but I was able to pull the wooden beam up. When I opened the barn door, it made a horribly loud creaking noise. I knew my grandparents had likely not been in the barn for years, so I was surprised I was able to get the door open at all. I figured the hinges had to be nearly rusted shut. As I mentioned, the barn was old, and even when it was in use, my grandparents would only have been in it during the day, so there was no light. Thank God that I live in the era of smartphones, though, because I, of course, had a flashlight on my smartphone. I had turned on the flashlight and just marveled at the creepiness. If dark is creepy, then just a minor amount of light makes it much creepier. I was fascinated by all of the tools, so many sharp implements. Most of them were hanging up. However, there was a small hatchet lying on a workbench. It was discolored, and on closer inspection, I realized that it was coated in dry blood. I don't know much about slaughtering animals, but I knew that my grandparents used to do it often. Chickens and pigs and stuff. So I figured that the hatchet was used for that purpose, and they never cleaned it. The barn had a loft that was filled with hay. I decided to climb the ladder and check it out. When I was shining the light around, it reflected off something buried in the hay. I was wondering if it was another tool or something, and decided to go check it out. Going over to it, I began moving the hay. I screamed when the empty eye sockets of a long dead corpse were staring directly at me. I fell backwards and nearly fell out of the loft. I quickly climbed down the ladder and ran out of the barn without closing the door. I rushed into the house and told my parents and grandparents about what I had seen. My father, a huge man, like Hulk Hogan sized, went out to confirm what I told him. My grandparents phoned the sheriff's office. The body had been in the loft for about 3 years. It had several hatchet wounds on it that the police told us were caused by the hatchet I had seen on the bench, the hatchet I had picked up. So not only had I found a dead body, but I held an actual murder weapon in my hand. That was truly disturbing to me. but it wasn't nearly as disturbing as the realization my grandparents had that they had lived in the house for 3 years without knowing a dead body was in the barn. No one was ever caught, and we to this day have no idea who killed that man and why. This all took place back in November of last year. I booked an entire trip in order to propose to my then girlfriend. Flew us both out to Florida to go to Disney World, the last concert of one of our favorite bands, and Berlin, and of course, propose. We had a blast. I proposed in the Disney castle. She said yes. Everything went well. We took off the next morning, Thanksgiving Day, on the way home, connecting through San Francisco. About 30 minutes into the flight, the captain comes on the intercom and announces that one of the engines wasn't depressurizing properly. We do a loop back to the airport and get unloaded into the terminal as we wait for another plane to be readied. When we get to the terminal, my now fiancée switched her phone back from airplane mode, and within a minute she had 10 plus voicemails, all from the same number, which she didn't know. Fearing the worst, we called the number without listening to any of the voicemails. I knew something was wrong as she started talking to them. Her face went blank and she didn't say a word. I told her to give me the phone and she did. I asked who it was and the voice I heard just sounded dead. Absolutely no hint of emotion to it. All he said was, "I will kill you both as soon as you land in Seattle." I asked who he was again, and he just hung up. She said she had no idea who it was, and I certainly didn't know the voice. I called him back, and he would answer and just repeat the time that we were landing. Little did he know, we were delayed hours. I used to work in telecom, and I pulled some strings to get a name and address from the phone number that he used. Neither of us knew the name nor the address. She looked him up on Facebook and she had one mutual friend with him, her ex-best friend. We'll call her Karen, that she no longer was friends with as she got wrapped up in heavy drug usage and stole from my fiancé. We did a little more digging and found out he was the boyfriend of Karen's new best friend. My theory is Karen saw all the posts that my fiancé was posting on social media about the trip, the engagement, and that great time we were having, and she was pissed and wanted to piss on our parade. I didn't take it as a joke, however. A death threat is a death threat, and in my mind, as meth heads, they could follow through with it on a whim. I called him and talked over his rambling and told him I was armed, knew where he lived, and was not afraid to take things into my own hands. He hung up on me, so I called the Seattle area law enforcement, and they told me to call back on a non-holiday. Are you kidding me? So I called the emergency line, and they reiterated the same statement. We were on our own. We ended up flying in close to 9 hours after our original arrival time. Once we landed, we both had a single voicemail. Hers, I assume, was from the guy, and mine, I had no idea, as he hadn't been calling my phone. My voicemail was from my dad, who said he had gotten a call from my neighbors saying that my mailbox had been destroyed. Looked like it had been hit by a car and the mail stolen from it. Her voicemail, however, was the guy screaming, "Where were you? How dare you?" and plenty of other threats, and random yelling. I drove home and dropped off my fiancée at her house, insisting she not come with me to my place in case there was someone still there. They threw a brick through my window with an old picture of my fiancé and Karen attached to it. I tried calling him, to no answer. I went to bed after covering up the window with a tarp and making sure my fiancé was okay. I filled out a police report the next day. They said I couldn't do anything without seeing them on my property. We blocked everyone involved on social media and went about our lives. I didn't hear from him for about 3 weeks when he sent me a picture of my fiancée working. I immediately called her and told her to go to the back of her work, a bubble tea shop. I then called mall security and explained the situation. but by the time they got to the food court where the picture was taken from, he was gone. At this point, I was done messing around. I knew his address and swung by and dropped off a note attached to a critical defense .40 bullet saying, "This is your last chance to leave her alone. This is your only warning." It's been almost 9 months now. Haven't heard a word or seen them again. But for both of our sakes, I sincerely hope not to meet you, Tyler.